Tractate Menachos continues covering the laws of the temple offerings. The prior tractate, Zevachim, went through the various laws of the temple animal offerings. This tractate will go through the different types of flour and grain offerings. These laws are very similar in many respects, but very different in others. A mincha offering, a flour offering, typically has 3 ingredients: flour, oil, and frankincense. There are specific measurements for each of these. There are a few types of mincha offerings, voluntary mincha offerings, of which there are a few different variants of plain flour, different methods of cooking it, etc. There are obligatory mincha offerings for a sinner, for a sota. There's a type brought by the Kohen Gadol and a type brought by the inauguration of a Kohen. There are communal mincha offerings, the Omer offering by Passover, the daily lechem apanim showbread, the 2 loaves by Shavuos, and there are libation mincha offerings, and also some additional variants. The Thanksgiving offering is brought with some breads, the Nazir needs to bring some breads along with his offering, etc. The actual mincha offering essentially consists of mixing precise amounts of flour and oil in a consecrated service vessel, which depends on the type of mincha offering being brought. Some of these mixtures are waved, they're brought to the altar, and some have a handful removed in a specific manner, a process called kimitza, which is then burned on the altar. Some mincha offerings are entirely burned on the altar. Besides, for all of these, this tractate also covers the principles of libations on the altar. Chapter 1 begins discussion on these laws. The first Mishnah says, by all mincha offerings, if their kimitza is done with intent for a different type of mincha offering, it doesn't fulfill its owner's obligation, but it's still valid. The only exception to this is the sinner's mincha offering and the sota's mincha offering, where it would be invalid. A sinner's mincha and a sota's mincha, if kimitza is not done for their own sake, or the kaimetz was placed in a service vessel not for their own sake, or he placed it on the altar or burned it not for its own sake, or if he said he's doing the service for its own sake and then not for its own sake, or he said he's doing it not for its own sake and then for its own sake, it's invalid. For example, intent for its sake and then not for its sake will be bringing the sinner's mincha for the sake of a sinner's mincha and for the sake of a donated mincha afterwards. And intent not for its sake and for its sake, meaning he did it for the sake of a donated mincha offering, which is not right, and then for the sake of a sinner's mincha offering, which is correct. The Gemara says, the Mishnah used a unique word when it said this offering doesn't count for its owner, except that it is still valid, which is to say that after this step, you cannot continue to have improper intent by it. It brings agreeing sources by the types of offerings. Now, there is an opinion which states, all mincha offerings whose kimitza is done with incorrect intent, it's valid, and it does actually count towards its owner, as he uniquely holds that mincha offerings and animal offerings are just not comparable. It debates as to what exactly he's referring to, but just concludes that our Mishnah just disagrees with this opinion. However, this opinion that says mincha offerings are not comparable to animal offerings also says elsewhere that the sinner's mincha is similar to the chatas offering, meaning there's invalidation if done with incorrect intents. Also, the donated mincha is like the asham offering, as if it's done with incorrect intents, it's still valid. So let's explain the differences. Originally, it was discussing a change in level of holiness of the offering, whereas here it's a change in the owner. And as there's no recognition of a change by this latter one, it's not invalidated. This principle is questioned from a number of cases. The bird olah, if its malika slaughter was done as a bird olah for the sake of a bird chatas, it's said it does not fulfill any obligation, even though it was actually done as a bird olah. So it's answered that doing malika as a bird olah doesn't prove it's a bird olah, so it would still be invalid. So a bird olah whose blood was squeezed in the manner of a bird olah with intent of a bird chatas is said to not fulfill any obligation, even though it was actually done as a bird olah. So it's answered, perhaps it could be being done in the manner of a bird chatas, as it's being squeezed after the sprinkling. This would mean that a bird chatas whose blood was offered as a bird chatas with intent as an olah would actually still be valid. Anyways, this opinion states that mincha offerings are not comparable to animal offerings. This implies that animal offerings are always damaged by incorrect intents, and it argues if this is the case from a number of particular scenarios, many of which were discussed in the prior tractate. Alternatively, some explain the variance between this opinion, that first he says a mincha offering brought with incorrect intent to be completely valid, and then he says it's somewhat invalid, to be that it's completely valid if the intent is another type of mincha offering, and it's somewhat invalid if the intent is for an animal offering. It quotes a few cases. A third opinion is valid if he says he's bringing the type of mincha offering, but doesn't actually say he's bringing a mincha offering. And where it's invalid is where he specifies he's bringing a mincha offering. It additionally debates this. The difference between these three opinions is that they disagree with the first one, that the variation is between discernibility in the offering, as they dispute the source for the concept, and as discussed throughout, there are debated issues with the other opinions. Anyways, the Mishnah stated that there is an exception, that the sinner's mincha and the sota's mincha, if done with incorrect intent, are invalid, which it sources. It goes through a number of verses. Anyways, some suggest to include in this exception the omer mincha, since it's not actually permitting any grain if it's done improperly like this. Some suggest the Mishnah didn't mention this as it wasn't addressing communal offerings, or maybe it wasn't addressing offerings that are brought with an animal, or maybe it wasn't addressing animals with a fixed time. So it's additionally then asked about the Nazir's Asham offering and the Metzorah's Asham offering with improper intents, which as they're meant to permit the Nazir and the Metzorah leper, but they're not actually doing so. So similar to this, in an effective Omer offering, they should be invalid. That's additionally disputed, quoting a few relevant discussions. Although it does quote a source which clearly says that if a Metzorah's Asham is brought with incorrect intent, it's still offered on the altar. These principles are discussed further going through verses, and additionally as to whether the Omer offering brought with incorrect intent is invalidated or not. The Omer offering is to permit the new grain by the 16th of the month of Nisan, but some say the grain just becomes permitted automatically as the day begins, even though the Omer hasn't yet been offered. Another opinion on the Omer offering brought with incorrect intent. Some say it's valid and its remainder can be eaten, and there is no necessity for another mincha offering, as he holds invalidating intent as a rule only takes effect if it's done by somebody fit to offer the service, meaning it excludes a blemished Kohen, with something fit for the service, excluding this, the Omer offering, and in a place fit for the service, which would exclude when the altar is damaged. It also quotes the source which prohibits animals with a defect from being offered on the altar, which it discusses. Regarding the source, it tries to refute it from our conversation on the Omer Mincha, which uniquely cannot be eaten but is offered on the altar, so it argues that the two can even be compared. It's also attempted to be disproven from comparison to the incense, Shabbos, and forbidden plant mixtures, where there's prohibitions for an ordinary person, but permissibility for particularly sanctified actions, like circumcision is allowed on Shabbos, or tzitzis, which is itself a forbidden mixture of wool and linen, are permitted, but those are all explained to be unique individually as their actual designated mitzvahs. So it suggests to derive it from a comparison to bird malika slaughter and from forbidden fats and bloods, which are all forbidden things towards people, but are given as offerings. But it said you can't compare defects in an animal to this, as those are all unique in that their characteristics aren't needed for a different forbidden object to be allowed for sacrifice. So another attempted source, we can derive it from a blemished offering, which is compared to a blemished Kohen. So it said that's not a valid comparison, as an animal born via C-section, for example, and a person born via C-section aren't compared, and yet an animal born via C-section can be eaten typically, but cannot be offered in the temple. That's additionally discussed. So in the end, it concludes the source for this concept needs to be derived from verses and not from a logical comparison. New Mishnah. By a mincha offering, whether the sinner's mincha or any of the other variants, if the kamitza service, removing a handful of a flour offering, is done by a non-Kohen, a mourner, an impure person who's immersed, but the day hasn't yet ended, somebody not wearing the priestly garments, somebody impure who hasn't yet brought his offering, somebody with unwashed hands and feet, somebody lacking circumcision, somebody impure, somebody sitting, somebody standing on utensils, on an animal, on another man's feet. In all these cases, the kamitza is invalid. If somebody does kamitza with his left hand, it's invalid. Others say he should just redo it with his right hand. If somebody does kamitza and winds up with a pebble in his hand, or a grain of salt, or a piece of frankincense, it's invalid as he needs to be holding a precise amount, not a heaping handful, and not too little, where he's only using the tips of his fingers. The Gemara says, it specified this applies to all mincha offerings, including the sinner's mincha offering, as there's an opinion that the sinner's mincha service can be done inelegantly, so it's saying all of this still applies to the sinner's mincha, especially as the first mission of this tractate was said to be contradictory to this particular individual's opinion. It's also said if a non-Kohen removed the kamitza handful, you should return it so it can be redone. This is in accordance with a similar opinion. This is as some suggest that certain steps of the offering service can be done by non-Kohanim, but others dispute this entirely, saying that slaughter, which we know can be done by a non-Kohen, is not considered to be part of the service. However, the slaughtering of a red heifer, for instance, would be a service, as it's considered like an item consecrated for temple upkeep. However, some say it's similar to examining symptoms of tzara'as leprosy, which must be done by a Kohen, but still isn't considered to be a service of the temple. Anyways, it further debates from additional discussions as to whether kamitza, if done by a non-Kohen, can be rectified by a Kohen. Some suggest that what's being said is that it'd be impermissible for the non-Kohen if he sanctified the kamitza handful by putting it into a second vessel to return it in that situation. That's additionally discussed, saying the kaimetz at least becomes sanctified to the degree that it becomes disqualified. Another suggestion is that the kaimetz handful is being returned to a full vessel with a hole in the middle of the flour by dumping it on the sides and then shaking it into the hole. So it's not like he himself is actually putting it into the vessel. It is debated based on the fact that the concept wasn't brought up here, as if returning kamitza to a vessel that's laying on the ground is invalid. It's said that doing this would in fact be valid. However, it is clarified to be valid that you can take kamitza from a vessel on the ground, but it is asked if you can put it into a vessel on the ground. It's said to be derived from the laws of the blood service, which must be done in a vessel that's actually held by a Kohen and not on the ground. Based on this, he also holds that a kometz handful is not sanctified if it's placed into two vessels, similar to the blood service, which are then sources. Verses are quoted. Some hold and source that kamitza inside the actual sanctuary would be valid, which it additionally discusses. Anyways, if the daily mincha offering of the Kohen Gadol was sanctified in halves, it's debated if this is valid, as it can actually be offered in halves. Others try and dispute this, saying it's compared to a typical mincha offering, which cannot be sanctified in halves. It's discussed. Some hold that a partial amount of the service cannot be sanctified, even if the owner intended to complete it, which it sources. Some say plain dry flour can be sanctified, which is discussed. Anyways, it said Kemitza is done by the north of the altar. It debates where this is sourced from, possibly as that's where the Chatas offering is done, but the two aren't comparable, possibly the Asham, but the two aren't comparable by a different issue. So it said that the Kemitza actually compares to the actual Mincha service itself, and you might think that as the Mincha must be done by the southwest corner, so must the Kometz, but a verse is quoted to show that it can be done anywhere. There are points on the other types of offerings. Anyways, if somebody mixed the Mincha flour with oil outside the walls of the courtyard, it's a debate between opinions if this is valid based on verses. An additional debate, if Mincha flour becomes deficient before the Kemitza handful is removed. Some say new flour can be added, others say you can't, although it rejects this latter opinion from a quoted case. Another dispute, if the remainder of the Mincha becomes deficient after the Kemitza handful is removed, but before the Kemitza was burned, is a debate if the Kemitza should be burned. It's said to be disputed based on whether it matters if there's still a remainder of the Mincha. It further disputes between these opinions. Anyways, we said Kemitza must be done with the right hand. Of course, the scriptural source for this, here as the verse, he brought near the Mincha offering and filled his palm with it. And elsewhere by the Mitzora leper, when it uses the word palm, it uniquely specifies that it must be done with the left palm, implying that all the other times it uses the word palm, it refers to the right palm. It mentions other instances of this concept applying by other verses and topics. Generally, most sacrificial services must be done with the right hand, which it additionally expounds on sources for. It further discusses these various verses. Anyways, we said if the Kometz handful has a pebble, salt, or a bit of frankincense in it, it's invalid. All of these were specified, as a pebble cannot even be offered, a salt is valid, and frankincense is a part of the mixture even initially. This foreign object would even cause an invalidation if it's off to the side and isn't causing an interposition. Anyways, as for the actual process of Kemitza, the way it's done is the Kohen uses his hand and starts scooping from his ring finger, using his middle three fingers until the mixture is in his palm, and that's a Kemitza handful. It's said to be a difficult service to get right. If somebody scooped using his fingertips, or from the side, or from the bottom, it's unresolved. In fact, there are a bunch of unresolved specific questions. For instance, what if the Kohen puts the Kemitza on the bottom of an inverted service vessel? It's unresolved if it's valid. New Mishnah. Anyways, the actual Kemitza service is done by scooping a handful of the flour offering and extending your fingers over the palm of your hand. If the oil is increased or decreased, or if the frankincense is decreased, it's invalid. The Gemara debates as to when it speaks of an addition to the oil, if this refers to consecrated oil. Anyways, by the frankincense, some say it's sufficient to have 2 particles, others say it can even be 1. A different source says any amount of frankincense missing makes it invalid, so some say this refers to any missing from the particle, others say it just refers to frankincense when it's being brought by itself, as opposed to an actual mincha offering. There are actually 3 opinions. Some say there must be a handful of frankincense initially and a handful at the end when it's burnt on the altar. Others say that there must be a handful at the beginning but 2 particles at the end. Others say a handful is required initially and only 1 particle at the end. This is all based on a verse. That's by the mincha offering specifically. If it's just frankincense being brought, everybody agrees it needs to be a handful at the beginning and a handful at the end. And by the frankincense that comes in 2 spoons by the showbread, it said it needs to be 2 handfuls at the beginning and 2 handfuls at the end. Others dispute plain frankincense as to if it could end off in a lesser amount. Anyways, the Mishnah said that there's only invalidation for decreasing the frankincense, which implies it's fine if it's increasing, although it would specifically be invalid if he had designated 2 handfuls for the mincha offering. Similarly, if somebody designated 2 handfuls of frankincense for the mincha offering, if one gets lost before Kemitza is separated, it's fine as they weren't established as part of the mincha. They would be invalid if one was lost after the kometz was separated. He'd also say if somebody designated 4 handfuls of the 2 spoons by the showbread, if 2 were lost before the spoons were removed, it's fine. If it was after, they're invalid. This is not repetitive, as since this offering's kometz is determined, you might have thought it becomes invalid at the time for Kemitza, not at the actual act of Kemitza. New Mishnah. If somebody removed a Kemitza handful from a mincha offering with intent to eat its remainder outside the temple courtyard, or even just in all of its volume, or the same to burn the kometz outside the temple, or to burn the frankincense outside the temple, basically in the incorrect location, the mincha offering is invalid, but there's no penalty of kares. If he did Kemitza with intent to eat the remainder the next day at the wrong time, or to burn the kometz or frankincense the next day, it's pigul, offered with improper intent, and there's liability. Essentially, if the steps of the Kemitza service are done with intent to eat or burn something that is meant to be eaten or burned in the incorrect location, it's invalid, but there's no penalty of kares. If his intent was to do it in the incorrect time, it's pigul, and there is liability of kares, which is divine punishment. This only applies if the permitter of the offering, here the kometz, was offered as required. It gives examples of doing this properly and improperly by us sinners, or sotas mincha. If the Kohen did the kmitza not for their own sake, and then did the service with intent for improper time, or he did that first and then did the service not for their own sake, or he did all the steps not for their own sake, that's an example of not offering the permitter as required, meaning there's no liability for pigul. If the Kohen intended to eat an olive's volume in the incorrect place, and then an olive's volume in the incorrect time, or vice versa, or half an olive's volume in the incorrect place and half an olive's volume in the incorrect time, or vice versa, it's invalid with no penalty of kares. Others actually disagree. Rabbi Yehuda says if the wrong intent of time came before the wrong intent of place, it's pigul, but the other way around, it's invalid with no kares. The sages say it's invalid with no kares either way. The Gemara asks, in accordance with the opinion that if the remnants of the mincha become deficient between kmitza and the burning, kmitza is still valid, and the remnants cannot be eaten. It's a debate of burning the kaimet with improper intent can make the remnants pigul, meaning they lose sanctity and can be benefited from. That's argued on by a few opinions. There's additional discussion on this. In the new Mishnah, if somebody wanted to eat half an olive's volume of the remainder at the wrong time and burn half the remainder at the wrong time, it's still valid, as intent for eating and burning don't combine. The Gemara explains the source for this principle as to who exactly it holds in accordance with. This whole principle is necessary to state besides for the concept that intent by eating the remainder and eating the actual kaimets don't combine, as you're not actually meant to eat the kaimets. So it also says intent by eating and burning don't combine, as both of those are actually done. And that's the end of chapter 1.